A very good afternoon, everyone. We are back with another very interesting panel today. The topic is India's economic slowdown and sustainable development goals. We have very learned panelists here with us for this discussion. To moderate this session, we have Dr. R. Sudarshan, Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. The panelists in this session are Dr. Indraneel Mukhopadhyay, Associate Professor, O.P. Jindal Global University, Kaveri Haritas, Associate Professor and Associate Dean, International Affairs at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, and Professor Rajiv Malhotra from the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. Welcome, panelists, and welcome, Professor Sudarshan, and please take it over for the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Arishi. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel and in this conference, which has been very interesting, the sessions that we've heard till now. We can't continually listen to all the sessions, which is a pity. And I hope that by the end of this panel, we would have get some clarity on a very difficult issue, which Rajiv Malhotra, my colleague, proposed, which is to look at the implications of, broadly the implications of the economic slowdown on the SDGs. But instead of remaining at a very stratospheric level, we thought we'll narrow it down to some of the SDGs, particularly related to work and labor, employment, and health. But then we know for a fact that while there's been a lot of literature on human development, and time and again, governments are requested to increase their investments in the social sectors, particularly education and health, and of course, jobs. When the Human Development Report was brought out by UNDP, it was in a way a kind of an answer to the stress that was placed by the World Bank on GDP growth. And GDP growth is not so much about the well-being of people as it is about the well-being of or how well an economy is doing. But it doesn't follow that if an economy is doing very well, people in that country would be doing very well. So a starting premise for this, of course, is to say that people are the real wealth of a country, and we ought to make an investment in people, not as means to growth, but as ends in themselves. That if people are thriving and communities are flourishing, that's the end in itself. So that was the sort of a big shift in the paradigm that prevailed until the Human Development Reports came out, placing the stress on human development and the well-being of people, and basically telling policymakers that they should focus their public expenditure on the social sectors. There was an index that was created, the Public Expenditure Index, that looked at how much of the expenditure of governments went into the sectors that directly affected people. And by and large, at the same time, while this was happening, there's also been a kind of a orthodoxy in economic thinking, which placed a great deal of emphasis on keeping the fiscal deficit under control, to keep inflation under control. And therefore, that meant that many governments were persuaded by the Bretton Woods institutions to reduce their public expenditure and not rely excessively on deficit financing, as that might cause problems and affect macroeconomic stability. And the easy way by which governments have cut expenditure is not by cutting defense expenditure, because that's something of a sacred cow, or expenditure on other things which they cannot help. Interest payments on loans taken, public debt is a big charge on public expenditure. So the way they managed, or most governments have managed, is by not increasing or even reducing public expenditure in the critical sectors. So what has been lacking in a way in this whole program of focusing on people and on human development is a proper macroeconomic framework. The COVID-19 crisis has in a way led economists to, those who were hardliners sticking to the sanctity of a low fiscal deficit, now find that the United States, which led this orthodoxy in thinking, is leading, has a very large public expenditure program sanctioned by the Biden administration. So these orthodoxies of macroeconomic thinking are being questioned, and therefore we need to get a good grasp of, it is not as if inflation will not hurt the poor, inflation will hurt the poor, but how much tolerance would there be for public debt, and when might it cross a danger mark? All of these are important questions which affect the agenda for achieving the SDGs at the broad level. And then when we narrow down and look at some of the specifics, as in the case that we will do in this panel, on the implications of digital technology on employment, where it's feared that robots would be doing much of the routine jobs, and machines would, of course, replace muscle, but machines are also replacing intelligence. And so there's artificial intelligence and machine learning, which poses a challenge to the kinds of conventional forms of employment that we've taken for granted till now. And so what's going to be the future of that? So I'll have Professor Kaveri Haritas address that issue. And more immediately, we are right in the middle of the pandemic. It is not over. It has serious public health implications. And there are enormous lessons to be learned from how this pandemic has been managed in different countries. You may put down the relatively low fatalities in India to either good management, as the government would want to do, or to good luck. It's difficult to tell what is the reason really why there are, compared to other countries, especially Europe and the United States, the pandemic has not had such a severe death toll in our country, but it's had multiple tolls of a negative kind on the population, and we are yet to learn the enormity and the impact of all of them. So we have Professor Indranil Mukhopadhyay who would address that. So with those introductory words to what my panelists are going to address us, I'll invite Rajiv to set the stage with the macroeconomic framework that's missing, desirable, feasible, possible.
Thank you, Chair. Let me just start by recalling that when the IPPN was originally scheduled, it was sometime in March, April last year. And although the concerns that we are going to talk about and the ones which the Chair has very cogently put forth already were apparent even at that stage. But what has happened in the economy since then, and not just our economy, globally, just reinforces these considerations which need to be really taken up front by policymakers right across the world. So in a sense, I would look at this pandemic in a kind of a more positive manner, notwithstanding the misery and the dislocation to economic activity it has brought about. But the positive aspect of looking at the pandemic is it's a time to think and redesign not only our macroeconomic policies, which is very critical, but get the structural bottlenecks cleared up. And we have seen a lot has been done in the country insofar as our health infrastructure is concerned, and the attention that is being given to science, to research and R&D in the health sector. All that is welcome, but it's a kind of a wake-up call that not only are the structural concerns to be addressed on priority, but the main issue with which I am concerned in this panel is how do we redesign our macroeconomic policies in a manner that we can meet our human development objectives more centrally, and more human development objectives such as the ones which are now embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals. So having said that, let me just, in the Indian context, which is what I guess our panel is focused on, let me start by saying that India was already witnessing a slowdown, a significant slowdown in the pace of growth since almost 4 to 5 years. And part of it was self-created. It was some of those goals which you end up seeing in matches, which are self-goals. We had a couple of policy-led shocks to the economy, which dislocated a large part of our economic activity, especially in the informal sector. And so that was already happening when pandemic came on us. And it further derailed everything. There was a complete stop on the movement of people, goods, resources, and so on. Now, so the first point I want to make and highlight is that this economic slowdown means we have less resources to play with insofar as our development goals are concerned, or more specifically, since the panel is focused more on SDGs, we have less of resources. And so there is a resource consequence of economic slowdown. The longer the slowdown persists, the greater would be the challenge to find resources to fund our efforts on the SDGs. That's my first point. The second point, which is equally important, and that is, SDGs, or for that matter, MDGs prior to SDGs, they served a very important purpose in the global development governance agenda. And that purpose was by way of standard setting and creating a policy focus on these objectives in a manner that countries could be encouraged to address them within the timeline that was specified. So this standard setting objective that is implicit in these global development objectives is very important. It brings with itself a whole lot of attention, which is forced on the policymakers very clearly. So in the context of pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, I would like to argue that there is a huge danger that we will lose sight of these objectives. There would be a policy focus on getting the economy back on track, and some of these short-term objectives will displace these medium-term concerns with which the global community has to grapple, and it's high time it grapples. So my second point basically is that there's a danger that if the recovery is slow and we take time to get back to our trend growth path, or the recently seen trend growth path, there's a danger that there may be a dilution of policy focus on these goals. And my third point is something that Chair has already alluded to, and that is, in this context of regaining the growth momentum and getting your macroeconomics right, are we going to support our efforts on SDGs, or revisit the whole macroeconomic framework with a view to bring in that kind of a flexibility, that kind of a heterodoxy in both the selection of objectives and the instrumentalities to use to get to those objectives if we need to do justice to our SDGs. And I like to argue, and I will stop after that, maybe come back after my colleagues have intervened, that we need to adopt a more heterodox macroeconomic approach. And in a very brief, what would that entail? It would entail that you need more objectives that the policy is directed at. It cannot be just simply directed at growth, getting the per capita growth back to the trend levels. It has to look at an important objective, and that objective is finding decent or formal or decent work opportunities in the economy. We cannot have growth only being productivity led. We have to have growth which is not just productivity led, but also generates employment. And the sad part is, if you look at the last 10, 15 years, or rather more than that, about 2 decades, India has been in a stage of jobless growth. So that's a major concern. And I'll come back to this point a little later, because I believe my colleague, Kaveri in particular, has something to say on the whole issue of work and the future of work. And I will share some more thoughts and reflections on how macroeconomic approach has to be looking at job opportunities as one of its explicit targets if we have to have any reasonable chance of getting to attain some of our SDG targets, in particular 1, 8, and 10. Let me just stop here. And
thank you. Ajay, we'll get back to you, because one of the things I want to tease out of you is views on, why isn't there talk about reviving, say, the Tobin tax? Why aren't we talking about having an inheritance tax in the country? Why are we still with the view that if you reduce corporate tax rates, it will be a stimulus to the economy? Very few governments seem to be focused on ways and means of raising revenue, which are needed for the SDGs over the medium and the long term till 2030. The government has decided to use diesel and petrol as a way of taxing people and filling its coffers, when an alternative could be tax rates on high income groups, corporate tax rates, all of this. So there seems to be a preference again. So the old orthodoxy of macroeconomic thinking doesn't seem to have shifted very much, is my point. And since you underline the importance of a heterodox approach, we'll have to come back to it before we conclude. But this nicely leads on to, Mahbubul Haq decried what he called jobless growth. He also had terms like ruthless growth, which is growth that creates great inequalities. He also had a term, rootless growth, which means growth that uproots people, building big dams and literally physically uprooting people, and not caring for cultural moorings of people. He called it rootless. So the jobless growth is the great concern, as apart from the others. So I'd like my colleague Kaveri to lead us off to a discussion on that. Over to you.
I can use share screen, so I'm just going to share my screen, a few slides just to give you an idea of the data. What I'm going to discuss today, a little bit of this data has actually featured in an earlier article that I mentioned here on my slide, which I've written with a colleague from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. India, as we know, has an increasing, a rising working age population. As you can see here, between 91 to 2016, the population, the working population has increased from 59 to 63%. On the other hand, we have a decrease in the percentage of employed population aged 15 to 64 from 59% in 91 to 50% in to around 50% in 2016. As you can see here, there is a decline in agricultural employment. This is of particular concern because masses of our population are engaged in agricultural work. It's declined from 62.7% in 91 to 44.2% in 2017. On the other hand, you see an increase in services, that is from 21.8% in 91 to 31.2% in 2017. This is something that I have, dealt with a little bit in detail in the article, but just to very quickly give you some sense of the loss in manufacturing jobs, because manufacturing jobs account for about 47% of total formal sector employment. And you can see a decline just in 2 years between 2016 and 2018. You see a minus 12,000 in 2016, and then another April to June, then 24,000, then 83,000, then 102,000, and then in April to June again a whopping minus 87,000 jobs. So what has been taking place in the manufacturing sector is that there is an increasing automation, both in the assembly as well as in component manufacture. Just to give you a sense, out of the 10 million new manufacturing jobs created in 2016, the automobile industry itself accounted for the largest number, that is 7.6 million. And in the entire sector, mostly in auto component manufacturing, but also in auto sales, services, transportation, and logistics, accounting for a total of 25 million jobs as of 2016. Automation is increasingly used by automobile companies. Just a sense of how many robots are replacing human labor. In Maruti Suzuki, it's about 5,000 robots in its plants in India. Ford's plant in Gujarat has about 500 robots, most of which operate in the body shop area, whereas its older plant in Chennai has only 100 robots. What we are also seeing is automation in other arenas of work, for example, retailing and warehouse jobs, that is e-commerce, which accounts for about 1 million jobs only. Bulk of these jobs are in logistics, warehousing, and delivery, which are also potentially automatable. And this is particularly after the GST, introduction of the GST. You can see some of this happening even in these warehousing jobs. Flipkart, for example, purchased 250 gray-orange warehousing robots in 2019. Amazon as well has been investing in robots. There is also remote customer service agents, plus the very large warehouses, the consolidation of warehousing that is taking place post-GST with very large warehouses, which makes it therefore very potentially automatable. There is an informalization of employment that is taking place at the same time. On the one hand, you have a decrease in employment of certain kinds, but on the other hand, there is an informalization of work. There is a decrease in public sector employment from 19.46 million jobs in 95 to 17.548 in 2011. On the other hand, there is an increase in private sector. I'll come to that at a later point in time. But one must also remember that this, I'm sorry, I think there is a mistake over here. Perhaps I will skip over that. There is an increase, on the other hand, in service jobs, as we spoke about, from 23.7% in 2000 to 26.9% in 2011 to 12. As did construction, so same with construction jobs from 4.5% to 10.6% in 2011 to 12. Now, service work contributes to about 51% of GDP in 2016, and this 15% is wrongly placed here. Is actually agricultural sector contributes to about 15% of GDP as of 2016. There is, on the other hand, an increase in the form of employment, meaning there is more of a contract labor taking place now, with less employment, less job protection. There is an increase in contract labor from 12% in 90 to 23% in 2002. India is actually the largest supplier of digital labor. Just to sort of conclude the previous part, the previous part was really on what you would call, unskilled labor, minimum wages labor, which has been on the decline, that is in the manufacturing sector. But these are all once again in the formal sector. What I'm now going to sort of move to is not the automation that is replacing workers, but the digitally mediated work. India provides 78% of all the online digital laborers are from India. India supplies the largest amount of digital labor in the world with about 15 million workers, and 78% of these are men. And half of them earn less than $10 per hour. The other sort of work, now digital labor, that is small piecemeal work, which is making codes of various sorts, is what I've talked about. But other forms of mediated work is what we see and what we use in our everyday life, that is Amazon, Flipkart, Uber, Ola, and Zomato, which are actually traditional delivery jobs, which are now mediated through technology platforms. Recently, in the 2020 assessment of work conditions by IIIT-B, in their Fair Work report, revealed the poor conditions of work, the poor employment security and health protection, apart from raising concerns on the refusal of platform economies to redistribute the profits earned, or even a part of the profits that they earn, to ensure decent work. There is therefore a need to sort of regulate both these things. On the one hand, regulate the replacement of human labor with robots or machines. There is a need to disincentivize replacement of humans with robots through taxes, to regulate and redistribute these gains from capital-intensive production that replaces labor with technology. Some of these debates have actually started in the European part of the world, where they are talking increasingly of what they call a robo-tax. On the other hand, there is also a need to regulate digitally mediated work platforms, because this also favors the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people, that is primarily with these technological platforms. There is a need to regulate wages, pricing, to regulate the increased surveillance of these workers, the transfer of risk to employees, that is to workers, the precaritization of work, and the deteriorating social protection. We see some sort of shimmer of hope in the Social Security Code that has been passed in 2020, where there is a provision that allows the state to tax the, require platform owners to set aside 2 to 5% of their annual turnover to protecting their workers. So with this, I come to an end end with my sort of presentation today. To conclude on I'm sorry, I can't see anything. Okay. I'm trying to get back. All right. Okay, to conclude my presentation, we see in both these forms of work, both the technological replacement of human labor as well as in technologically mediated work, there is a potential to increase inequality of wealth by enabling companies to become wealthier at the cost of the poorest and the most marginalized. There is, like I said, I spoke about the Social Security Code. There is a provision now, and we are hoping that the government does a little bit more. To give you a sense also in terms of technologically mediated work itself, there are about 30 lakh people employed in technologically mediated work. That's on platforms. So it looks like there is also a shift in work from traditional forms of employment to more technologically mediated employment. And therefore, this might therefore provide a sort of a political base, a group of people who would therefore put pressure on the government, which would then enable some amount of regulation and then force the government to think a little bit more in lines of redistributing some of this wealth and providing for social security benefits. So with this, I come to an end with my part of the presentation. Just a last word is on data, that we don't really have a lot of data on what's happening. We tend to see all of these figures that are there in our regular data collection efforts, but we do not have data on, for example, the replacement of human labor by technology. On the one hand, we know Flipkart has just taken in 100 robots, but on the other hand, we don't know how many employees that has replaced. There is one needs to also be careful, because this is not a completely dark future. There are shifts in employment, meaning that there are some sorts of jobs that is very minimal skill jobs that will be replaced with slightly better skilled jobs. But this essentially again brings us back to the question of what to do with the mass of India's population who are very minimally skilled, who don't have access to good education or to skill development. How do we then sort of also regulate the shift in employment from low-skilled manual forms of labor to slightly better skilled labor? And here, the government also has to play a role in, first of all, collecting data and recording these shifts. Secondly, coming out with policies and schemes to provide for skill development to be able to shift these workers from these old forms of labor to the new forms, to slightly better skilled jobs that are now being made available in both these forms of work.
Thank you very much, Kaveri. That was quite fascinating. And so the what one doesn't know right away is, in the past, technology that was seen to be, when computers were first introduced, I remember, computers were, the supercomputers were provided by UNDP. Since I worked there, I know. So the National Informatics Center was set up. So at that time, there was a move on the part of Air India to computerize its ticketing. That is before the railways. And the Air India employees went on strike because they feared they would lose jobs. But in fact, the advent of that technology actually increased possibilities of employment. But we are not sure about what's going to happen with robotics and artificial intelligence. As you pointed out at the end, there needs to be some conscious policy choices to be made as to how to prepare people for the advent of these technologies, so that they benefit and have gainful employment. Because at the end of the day, if you're saying human beings and their sense of contentment and well-being is what matters, it's important for human dignity to have work. What is the kind of work? It's another matter. But having no work would rob a person of a sense of self-worth, self-respect, and dignity. And therefore, that's in danger, and we have to worry about it. So we'll come back, maybe there'll be some questions for you on this. I'll now invite Indranil to discuss, what we are currently living through, the concerns about vaccine nationalism, inequities of a kind, and so on. So over to you, Indranil.
Thanks, Professor Sudarshan. It was fascinating listening to Rajiv and Kaveri. And I think you have set the context very well. How do we look at technologies? Is it important to look at the production conditions and the way it is getting produced, how it is being transferred? And I think the current vaccine situation epitomizes some of this. And what I would like to argue here is that there are inequalities. I'm going to talk about these inequalities. And somewhere, if we can find a solution to how we see or ensure access to universal vaccination, that might lead us to better reach the SDG target. So there are a lot of connects that one can build if we look at the vaccines. Okay, yeah, you mentioned about ruthless growth, and we are this week is just a year after after the lockdown was introduced, and it was, needless to say, ruthless on a lot of people. There were huge impoverishment that Rajiv has already talked about, and I just wanted to set the context. But when we were looking at the situation of helpless migrant workers going back to their places and desperately thinking what could be the solution, we didn't know that within a year we'll talk about vaccines. Our history of vaccination had told us that vaccines take 5 to 10 years to develop. So what is so interesting to look at this is that there is a lot of global cooperation that took place in this situation. A lot of that had been led by public investment. What we see today is cooperation between governments and multilateral organizations on the front of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and also to some extent health systems. That has led to whatever response the health domain or health system could put up against the pandemic. I'm not focusing much on the poverty and other aspects, but if we look at, in fact, if you look at only investments on vaccines, you will see that 80%, more than 80% have come through public resources, public cooperation. So, and now that we have around 14 vaccines on various stages of development, some are on very advanced stages and are being administered across the country, what strategy shall we take? Because the numbers tell us that the global inequalities persist in case of vaccination also. If you look at, say, how many vaccine doses have been administered currently, it's a very recent UNICEF data till yesterday. Out of 100 people in North America, there are 24 doses have been provided. Of course, ideally, to have all the adults vaccinated, sometimes some vaccines need 2 doses, some need 1. But on an average, this can give a sense of the access to vaccination. In North America, it is around 24, whereas in Africa, it's less than 1. So though we are seen as one of the success stories in all of this, that India is able to produce a lot of vaccines, provide many developing countries, and this is a commendable success. We need to note that some of these also came through public investments in research, and that are being gradually handed over now to private sector. The question is whether for profit or not. I'd like to deal with the inequality question with a bit of data crunching that I did in last few days. And if you look at vaccine doses per 100 people and per capita income.
Sorry, Indranil, I'm interrupting. I want you to go back to the previous slide, please.
Yes.
Just interpret the data on the bottom on the inequalities in access to vaccine. What inequality indicator is this?
So I'm not, okay, this is not a measure of inequality. I'm not looking at any measure. It is just that how many doses of vaccination per 100 people.
All right.
This is a descriptive statistics. This is not any inequality measures. I'll come to more, again, the same indicator I'm trying to link with per capita income. And we have country-wise data, and we have, what I've done is I have color-coded the continents to look at where more vaccination is happening. If you look at the panel on the left, these are number of vaccine doses per 100 people. The country on this higher side will have more numbers compared to its per capita income. This top left extreme is Israel. And there is a very interesting story on how Israel has not only universalized its vaccine program, but how systematically it is denying vaccines to Palestine and also some other countries. A lot of interesting insights are coming up. But if you carefully look at this top part where vaccination is happening, you'll see that most of these countries are North American countries, European countries, some, of course, Asia, like Emirates or Bahrain, or some of the rich Asian countries are exceptional, but largely North America, Europe. If we go to countries which have less than 10% of population vaccinated, because I wanted to have this subset talked about, because this is where our reality is. Even in this panel on the right, you will not see many African countries coming up on the north side. So large part of Africa are lingering in the bottom, where it's around. Many African countries do not have any access to vaccination. Many Asian countries, poorer Asian countries, are also facing the same situation. Why this is happening? We need to, and as I argued earlier, much of the vaccine development process has been led by public investment. So now if we look at the way vaccine advanced procurements have taken place, or supply commitments have been made, and if you look at say United States, European Commission, even Brazil, UK, Canada, large volumes of vaccines have been either procured by them, or they have been able to have understanding with the pharmaceutical vaccine manufacturing companies to stock up a lot of these vaccines. US has 4 times the vaccine they need for their population. Canada has 11 times, EU 3 times. WHO COVAX, which is the column on the left, is about a collective that is supposed to cater to 20% of the poorest section of the world. I'll come to COVAX. But even COVAX has less procurement compared to, or sorry, slightly higher procurement compared to what US has procured so far. Now, there is a lot of pressure within the US to release some of these vaccines. And then Biden has actually said that they will share some of these vaccines to NAFTA countries like Mexico and Canada. Look at Canada. It has 11 times more than what they need. Mexico is also able to procure significantly. What is the point? What is needed is much of the Asian and African countries need to be supported from this. And if you look at prices of these vaccines that are being, the price agreements that are being negotiated with various companies, you'll see large variation across the world. Some countries like US, Hungary, high income countries are paying a lot of price to buy up these vaccines. And essentially, this is in a way to create sustained monopolies and also deny a large section of people their right to get vaccination. Now, this is a strategy which is like shooting on your own foot, because the problem is you cannot only protect your own population. Unless you protect the entire world, the cost of not vaccinating the entire world would be much, much more, because the world is so much connected. Unless we have a global response to this, unless we vaccinate every individual who needs vaccine, we are not able to protect ourselves adequately. There is an estimate from International Chamber of Commerce, and they are actually saying that countries should try to create a situation where vaccine reaches everyone rather than getting caught up in this vaccine nationalism. Their estimates suggest that $5 trillion would be the cost of not vaccinating the world. And how much is needed to vaccinate everyone in the developing country, particularly say the bottom 20%, around $38 billion. This is a WHO COVAX estimate. Quickly on the WHO COVAX, this is a system that has been created by WHO Global Alliance Against Vaccine and Immunization, a global fund, putting some money together to produce, to encourage production of vaccines, buying those vaccines and distributing globally. They're not able to procure adequately at all. The WHO is repeatedly requesting rich countries to not go for bilateral agreements with vaccine manufacturers because they're jacking up prices and ending up denying much of the developing world their due. So this has not been able to, so they're falling much short of the current target of 6.4 billion vaccine doses they need. Not even half of their target is filled so far. We saw this in the earlier. Okay, now the other crucial barrier to access to vaccines and medical products in this COVID period would be the TRIPS. Some of the COVID-related products are under various kinds of intellectual property rights. These are related to copyrights, industrial designs, patents, trade secrets. Not all are covered under TRIPS. And India and South Africa put up a proposal before WTO, to seek waiver for certain obligations under TRIPS. There is a huge resistance from various countries against this, though many developing countries have come up in support. If we look at this map, global map of who is supporting India and South Africa in this call to relax TRIPS waiver and IPR waivers at this point of time, you will see that the crosses are who are against it. It's quite obvious where they are located. Is the Europe, much of the Europe or OECD countries, the rich countries are actually resisting, even they're delaying the process of WTO discussion on this. Though there is a larger coalition that is being built, many countries are signatory to this, many developing countries have supported the call, so the larger alliance is being formed, and that's the way forward. That's one of the major ways through which this current crisis can be avoided or mitigated. There is also this technology access pool that WHO has created in order to facilitate pool various rights to technologies, detect, prevent, and for the detection and prevention and control of the COVID pandemic. And we need countries to comply to support this. This is currently a voluntary mechanism. And if countries cooperate with WHO, a lot can be achieved in this. Now, there are some rays of hope within the developed world as well. Canada has amended its Patent Act. France has enacted emergency law to relax some of the patents, and Germany has also made changes in this in their patent law, keeping in mind the current situation. So, I'll stop where I'll conclude here. We need to come out of this crises or inequalities, not only in vaccination, but we need to see this COVID vaccines or technologies as global public goods in this current pandemic. Because it is not about only about scientific discoveries and where there is a lot of public support, governments have put in a lot of resources towards this. Now, the developed world need to come together and put in additional resources so that the world can come out of this crisis adequately. I'll just say a few things about India's vaccine situation. Though we are seeing ourselves as one of the success stories, no doubt there is a lot of positive, and India is doing much better than many of the developing countries. But we would also fall short of vaccines if some of our candidate vaccines are not given clearance, or if we don't get support from the developed world or WHO COVAX adequately. Because prices are going to jack up as many countries start hoarding vaccines. So even in order in a better place country like India, we need global cooperation to avoid this crisis. I think the COVID crisis will tell us how to approach SDGs differently, and the way would be to see public health, many aspects of public health, as global public good rather than source of profit. I'll stop here and would look forward to questions.
Thanks very much, Indranil. I think we've laid out a rich fare. I hope we've provoked some questions from the participants. I think maybe Arushi will help us with questions that may have been posted. Are there any, Arushi?
Not something that I can't see here, but I've just asked the backend team to push questions if they have there.
Okay, so now so let me then ask the question that is prompted by the last few remarks that Indranil made, which is about global public goods, and of course, quite clearly, very often we use the term public good economists would use it a little more precisely. Anything where you can put a price on it and exclude some people, even though it has enormous benefits to the public. Education is an example, or health is strictly speaking a merit good in economic parlance. And so in that sense, because prices have come into pretty much everything, and there's pretty little that nowadays that money cannot buy. The question arises as to do we have for increasing the supply of such goods, global public goods, let's call them, because whether it has to do with reduction of carbon emissions in order to save the planet and from warming and climate change, or whether to save oneself from the risk of being reinfected with COVID-19 because others will be carrying the virus in a virulent form if they are not protected themselves by vaccination. All of these call for a kind of my concern is that, our national governments, the UN Charter, sovereignty of nation states, making policies, domestically, seems to be very inadequate. I mean, we need, more than ever, some kind of system for global governance in order to increase the supply of global public goods. And all of these, we seem to have receded from a position where we made some headway. In other words, at least the WTO provided a framework, but now there are so many regional trade agreements. The multilateral system, faith in a multilateral architecture for development, for these things, seems to have diminished. So, while some questions from the participants are being taken up, I'd like your reflections on this as to what do we do in this situation? Because, will this pandemic restore faith and increase the viability of multinational cooperation, or will it worsen it? So let's go in reverse order, since you raised the public goods point, Indranil, and then I'll go to Kaveri and then Rajiv. And meanwhile, there may be a question or two that we could tackle. We have 5 more minutes. Indranil?
Okay, shall I? Okay, I thought I have already shared my views.
I'm talking about, what is your view on the prospects for multilateralism, global cooperation, for increasing the supply of global public goods?
So I think there are two parallel trends going on. The pandemic has taught us the value of global cooperation more than ever. Many countries are coming together. That is one, and particularly developing countries are coming together. There is also a desperate attempt to make some profits from existing situation, and it's being intellectually challenged to a great extent, and also developing countries are coming together. There, that the logic of intellectual property rights have been probably defeated more than ever. That investments can happen only when you protect certain monopolies. The global cooperation, and we tend to forget that a lot of the innovations which are transformative, which are original innovations, happen in public domain using public resources, which then gets transferred to make profit out of it, and some of these are protected over. I think that is being challenged, which is a good thing. Globally, we need to come out strongly against this. I don't know which way. It will depend. Again, it's essentially a deeply political question. It's not only about few people theorizing it. It's in the praxis. So I think how the world sees it will, we have to see it how it unfolds. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, is there any question?
Yes, there is one question that we've just got. This is from Sridhar Kundu. He's asking to Dr. Sudarshan, is FRBM an orthodox policy?
Well, I'll have Rajiv answer that.
Yes, I'll be
years back in the finance ministry.
I'll be happy. So FRBM could be seen as an orthodox policy given the kind of context we are in right now. Heterodoxy demands that we cut down our fiscal deficits, and all other exigencies are kind of sacrificed at the altar of fiscal deficit. But a situation such as the one which we find ourselves in requires a rethink on the way we go about addressing it. And especially if you link it up with the SDGs, which is what the topic of this panel is, we need to protect certain public expenditures, certain social sector expenditure, certain social security expenditure. And if in the protection of that, and in the face of growth slowdown, compromising or undermining your tax revenues, there is no way but to free or to look beyond the FRBM specified targets. And that's generally what we should be looking at this juncture in our country. So to answer your question, yes, a very strict following of FRBM, given the kind of context which we find ourselves in, would be a very orthodox perspective on the issue. But we need to look beyond that.
Yeah, but Rajiv, just a point of detail on this. The FRBM, we've made some amendments so that the curtailment of revenue deficit has been given the go by, and so then when you increase just revenue expenditure, rather if you make investments in capital expenditure and you free up restrictions so that you can increase, you can have more borrowing for more capital investments, then that will have a multiplier effect and contribute to growth. But if you're just going to not do that and just keep paying more interests and on the revenue side. So we've made some changes in the initial framework.
Sure.
And that has been, that's been negative in a sense, because it's allowed governments to look at the fiscal deficit, but not worry about the revenue deficit so much. So I think we need to revisit this with some new lens. That's an important question.
Right. So just as a way, by way of sharing an anecdote, when I was very much in the finance ministry, in fact, I was instrumental in pushing for a new terminology there. We talked of effective revenue deficit. You see, what was happening was that the center was transferring a lot of money to the states, which were basically being used for education, the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan and other things. And they were by nature, they were revenue expenses. So although your revenue deficits were increasing, but the nature of composition of that spending was such that it was desirable. So we coined this new terminology that we should be looking at effective revenue deficit rather than revenue deficit. But to speak to the larger point you made, there have been several instances where this whole framework has been revisited, including now by the 15th Finance Commission, the N.K. Singh-led commission. They have also looked into the FRBM, and certain target variables have been changed. We are now looking at the debt GDP ratio and the back to revenue deficit rather than focusing on fiscal deficit. So the glide path is being defined in terms of these two parameters rather than just fiscal deficit. But yes, it needs a discussion. And my kind of take would be that we need to kind of relook at it from the point of the context in which the economy is, and we need to be more flexible. And it is inbuilt in the original act, had a fair amount of flexibility, and the parliament had to be taken on board to exercise that flexibility. But between 2004 when it happened and now, a lot of water has flown through Yamuna, and we certainly need to relook at some of these things.
Thank you, Rajiv. I think we've come to the end of the session. We don't want to have a cascading effect,
domino effect
on other sessions. So Arishi, we'll hand it over to you, and hopefully those who listened in found it interesting and somewhat educative.
I'm sure they would have. Thank you so much, Professor Sudarshan, for leading such an amazing discussion. Thank you, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy and the Jindal Global University as such for being there. We've been partnering, and we look forward to these kind of sessions even in the future. Thank you, Kaveri. Thank you, Indranil, and thank you, Professor Malhotra, for being here. I'm sure the audience enjoyed every bit of this discussion, and there is a lot of food for thought after this. Thank you.
Thank you.